Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome back to our afternoon and closing keynote session for day one of the Investable Showcase 2021. Thanks to everyone for joining us throughout the day with both the panels, the presentations, the masterclasses, the interactive sessions, and yeah, delighted to be rounding off today with I think a sort of pretty globally focused session, starting with the end in mind, building a European as well as US commercial strategy in time to make a difference. We have a fantastic sort of multi-stakeholder or multi-persona group here to sort of discuss this session from biotech, from investors, and from pharma. So please do keep your questions coming in for this group in the chat and questions function on the right-hand side of where you're viewing this video, and we'll get to as many as we can throughout the panel and indeed towards the end. So delighted to hand over to our moderator for today's session, Mel Walker. Mel, I'll leave you to take us on, introduce yourself and indeed the panel.
Thank you very much, Josh. Good afternoon and welcome to this panel, rather succinctly titled Starting with the End in Mind, Building a European as well as a US Commercial Strategy in Time to Make a Difference. My name is Mel Walker. I'm Managing Director of Biopharma Futures and have a few strategic advisory roles as well. I'm personally passionate about ensuring that patients gain access to truly innovative products. And one really important way of doing this is helping companies to make the right choices during early commercial planning to ensure that products can be launched globally and not just in the US market, hence the topic for today's panel. We have a really great senior and experienced panel to discuss the topic. And so before we kick off, I'd like each panelist to give a very brief introduction to themselves and their current role before we start. I'm going to start off with Tim.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. A pleasure to be here. My name's Tim Haynes. I'm the Chairman and Managing Partner for Abingworth. We're one of the leading transatlantic life sciences investors. We've been around for 48 years. So we've seen a lot of changes over that time. Offices in London, East and West Coast. We've got over $2 billion under management. And we invest everywhere from twinkle in professors' eyes all the way through to public companies, primarily biopharmaceuticals, and we certainly like platforms a lot. So pleasure to be here and look forward to a good discussion.
Thank you, Tim. Barak?
Thank you, Mel, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here today with all the panelists and the participants. Name is Barak Selek, and I'm the head of global commercial strategy at Ellucis. And at Ellucis, we are committed to transforming psychedelics into medicines and unlocking the full potential of psychedelics in psychiatry and beyond. We do this well with the end in mind, Mel, and we face the same challenges that pre-commercial biotech everywhere in all the other fields do. So with that, I'll hand it off back to Mel.
Thank you, Barak. Eric?
Mel, yeah, pleasure to be here. My name is Eric Landenberg, CEO of AIM Pharma, company based in the Netherlands, where we're developing a drug for acute kidney injury, late stage clinical development, phase 3. And on the board of several companies that are more in earlier phase of pharmaceutical development.
Thank you, Eric. Joep?
Yeah, Joep Myers. Thanks everyone for joining. Nice to be here. I work for Gilda Healthcare. Gilda looks at the healthcare space quite broadly: private, public, therapeutics, med devices, health tech. Myself, I joined quite recently to specifically focus on the more later stage public, early public and then later private opportunities. And my background is mainly on the investment side, but I've also been on the banking side, and I was operational for the past 3.5 years in Boston, a company called PureTech.
Thank you. And then Matthias, please.
Absolutely, pleasure to be here. So Matthias Nürnberg, I'm heading Global Business Development and Alliance Management at the healthcare business of Merck KGaA, Darmstadt, Germany. So Merck KGaA operates across a number of TAs such as oncology, neurology, immunology, fertility, cardiovascular, metabolic disease, and endocrinology. And we're very actively seeking partnerships for preclinical and clinical stage assets across all of these TAs. Background is MBA and PhD by training, and really looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Matthias. So by way of an introduction to the panel topic, I just want to take our minds back to the late 1990s. And I don't know, those of you who remember launching products at that stage in Europe would remember that all you needed was a marketing authorization and a very robust physician marketing effort. But I think all of that changed and has changed over the last 20 years. I pick out a couple of things. In 1999, NICE was set up, and then in 2011 AMNOG came into being in Germany, ending the sort of last free pricing market in Europe. And of course there was many more reforms that I could talk about which I haven't mentioned, leading to an environment in Europe which is considered fairly challenging. I think regulators over the last 10 years have recognized that challenge to the extent that they've established parallel or joint advice processes with HTAs to try and get the HTA requirements for evidence built into development programs in order to ensure the products they approve actually get into the hands of patients. I think Big Pharma have adapted their early commercial planning to incorporate these requirements to ensure they continue to launch products globally. So then I want to fast forward back now to 2021. The US market continues to be the most important market, around 58% in value, but only 24% of the volume. That speaks to the price differential that we see. A RAND analysis recently stated that the US pricing was roughly 3.5 times a basket of around 30 to 32 other markets that were comparable markets. But of course, this covers a range of differentiation from highly differentiated products where the price differential is relatively small to much less differentiated products, or Me Too's, where I've seen certainly 20, 25 times differential in pricing. So the other thing I wanted to point out by way of introduction is what we've heard over the last couple of years around the US drug pricing and healthcare reforms. And I know that there's been lots of proposals on the table, some more draconian than others, and all of that, yes, has yet to pan out to see what we'll actually end up with. But what I would say is that Big Pharma is pretty worried about those reforms. I just read an article recently about the amount of money they've spent on lobbying, and they've really, that goes into the hundreds of millions of pounds they've spent, or sorry, dollars they've spent on lobbying in the US to try and prevent some of the more hardcore reforms from materializing. But I think even if we disregard the current reforms, an IQVIA report recently stated that the payer is now the dominant stakeholder in the US and indeed most major markets. They are becoming bolder in the US. They're increasingly willing to say no to products and heavily restrict products that don't offer value. And in some cases, they're even restricting products to where the value is proven in clinical trials rather than allowing the broader FDA label to be applied. Data also tells us in the US that launches, around a third of launches underperform their expectations, and in 50% of cases that's down to payer access issues as the primary driver. So all of this, I think, creates a picture that I think we can be sure that there is changes afoot in the US market, and they will come. I think the key question for us to crystal ball is how far will those changes go and how fast will they come. But certainly I think if we're developing assets that are going into the clinic now, we can be confident to some degree, or worried to some degree, that the environment we end up launching in may be quite different to the one that we currently face today. So why do I think that's important? Because the point of the panel session today is really thinking about global commercial strategy rather than just US commercial strategy. And my hypothesis is that if we can start to incorporate more of ex-US market requirements earlier during clinical development, then not only will we be pointing towards developing global assets, but also we will start to hedge some of the risk of the future or potential future US market scenarios, where payers may be increasingly willing and able to adopt more measures from other markets that could really challenge pricing and access. The reason why we've focused on Europe a little bit here, though it should really be ex-US, is because although Europe is fragmented, there are very clear themes, I think, that can be both assessed and addressed by drug developers. And I think that by addressing some of these themes and using the mechanisms that are at our disposal, we can potentially develop more robust commercial strategy, make sure that we have access for patients globally, as well as future-proofing returns for investors if some of those US healthcare reforms turn out to be less favourable than we all hope. So I think with that, that's my 2 pennies, and I'd like to hand over to the panelists for their thoughts on the topic. I'm actually going to go in reverse order and start with Matthias and work back. So Matthias? Sure,
absolutely. And maybe let me make an initial statement really here from the BD buy side, from the pharma perspective, right? And I just want to clearly echo what he said. I mean, we also start these discussions typically when we look at acquisition targets or simply licensing or partnership opportunities with having the end in mind. So that's really, really important to us. And it's important to us because companies such as Merck, we are present in 65 countries around the globe where we really develop and commercialize our products according to local needs, regulations, and standards. And if you think about it from that perspective, I think it's really super, super important that you have this kind of globally diversified commercial strategy for each of your assets, or in this case, the assets that we want to partner. And I guess we will explore that a little bit further in the panel. But maybe in a nutshell, the message should be that pure R&D success is just not good enough anymore. Yeah? We specifically look at regulatory aspects and really very thought through market access pricing strategies when it comes on evaluating how CDPs, so clinical development plans, have been designed. And as Mel said, the earlier, so to say, this global mindset is embedded into these programs, and you have also the right understanding of the market access pricing environments in these diverse markets outside the US, the easier it is to quickly scale these opportunities up, and also the higher the valuation is that we, from a buyer perspective, can attribute to, let's say, a collaboration or an M&A target. I think the question that is a little bit out there is how that is best achieved, in terms of, you know, what funding is required at what point in time, and where is really the right time to lift that commercial value. I'm really looking forward to explore that in today's panel.
Thank you, Matthias. Jörg, can I go to you next for your opening thoughts?
Sure. So I think you set the scene very well, Mel, and it's clear that the space is complex and becoming more complex. I remember where I was quite a few years ago now, the first time I looked at the infrastructure of the US Bayer environment, and it took me quite a bit of time to really fully grasp all of the players and the moving parts, and then probably that picture is completely obsolete today. And then you look at the European landscape, and yet again quite different. So it's a daunting task for companies to be on top of all of that. However, in my opinion, the writing is on the wall. The times where reimbursement was an easy and simple thing are long gone. If you're not innovative, then you don't stand a chance, I think, at this day and age. And I would agree with the fact that you need to have this kind of global perspective. The US is a very important market, at this point, the most important market. But again, you only have to look at the newspapers in the last few weeks to realize that things are changing there as well. And nobody knows exactly what will change at what point in time, but you better stay on top of that. And maybe some of the measures that are being put in place in Europe, that are already in place in Europe, you know, maybe some of those things will come in the US at some point as well. So in my opinion, there's a lot of things you can ask for from a management team. And then we at Gilda try to support our companies by providing access to regulators, payers, and things like that. You know, at the end of the day, it's also typically an operational question. We'll get to that. What can you do with a smaller team? What can you look at? And it's a question of where would you want to partner? Or maybe certain geographies where you cannot do this yourself feasibly, and you have to talk to people like Matthias who have the global scope. So those are some opening comments, but I think it's a very relevant topic, Mel, because again, there's no way as a management team you cannot be, you know, very well vetted in this space and still expect the launch to go well.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to Eric next.
Well, yeah, definitely the landscape has changed, and we do need to incorporate measures that are important from a market access perspective in the design of our clinical trials. So at AIM Pharma, for example, we already took in relevant measures like quality of life and other related items that are important for payers, like, you know, the average cost involved with treating a patient. we're in the hospital setting, in the intensive care. ICU days are very expensive, rehospitalizations are very expensive. So those measures are taken along in our studies, already in phase 2 and now in phase 3 again. So it's important indeed in the design phase to think through at least the major markets, what is required to be able to launch a successful drug, also from that market access perspective. But not only from a market access perspective. Maybe to Matthias and Joep's point, so the partnering is always a criteria as well for biotech. Either the moment that you will partner, for example, traditionally after proof of concept, sometimes, of course, it's much earlier these days, but also much later. But also the geographic areas. What can you take into account into your global development plans and whatnot? So I think most biotechs, at least from the European side, will take into account at least US as well as European considerations from the regulatory as well as from the market and pricing perspective. A truly global trial, of course, would then also at least think through a strategy for Japan and China, which needs to be conscious choices, because either they're in a global study or not, and that has a very definitive impact, of course, on when you can launch in these territories. So those are all important aspects to take along. Indeed, for biotech companies, let's not be naive. You have to develop a compound as if you would launch it yourselves. That's your strategy or not. And which includes indeed taking these market access commercial settings into account, the right comparator and the right data collection. So very important indeed.
Brilliant. Thank you, Eric. Appreciate that. Can I go to Berak next, please? Berak, are you on mute?
Sorry, somebody ought to do it. I do agree with most of the things that were said. And I think from a small biotech perspective, I want to open with the fact that, US is, of course, the focus because it is the largest market. But US is not a single payer market, nor is it a single market. US has the Medicare, Medicaid, commercial payers who have different formularies, different therapy areas, state, city levels are different from each other's. Each payer will have different contracts, coding systems, reimbursement levels for each drug. So this, from a small biotech perspective, is already a quite complicated market in itself to crack. And then you bring on the European perspective, right? A pan-European approval does not mean market access, pan-European. Germany will have a different perspective. HUS will be different. IFA will be different. NICE will be different. So it's really, what are the key metrics from a management perspective, from a small biotech perspective? What are the decisions that one can make so that the initial muscle and evaluation muscle in the small biotech is able to identify the key points where they need to consider ex-US considerations, whether that's Europe or Japan or China, but also what knowledge and what information could they bring to the team. That's also very critical, because also small biotech doesn't necessarily have all the resources for contracts and consultants that can feed in. So how do you build a team that knows the time, the expertise to know where the key points in that CDP clinical program development they need to target, and what considerations they need to be aware of and when?
Thank you, Berak. And over to you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Malik. I think this is a hugely important topic, but actually it's one that's got significantly more important for the biotech industry over the last 10 to 15 years. There's really been, two significant changes as regards to the biotech industry. The first one, of course, is kind of a coming of age of biotech. Over 60% of late-stage assets are biotech derived. So the model really works, and that's been reflected in the ability to raise capital. Last year, 25 billion investor dollars, including some of ours, went into the industry. $25 billion raised through IPO, and God knows how much money was raised through secondaries. So I think the access to capital has changed our all recognition to significant amounts of capital for biotech companies with those ambitions. I think the second real driver and change and why market access is important is, of course, the growth of more rare disease targeted, be they gene therapy, cell therapy, where you're not looking for mass market opportunities, but a biotech can reasonably have an aspiration to sell into very focused markets and physician communities in the US and indeed in Europe. And I don't know, I think there's something like 200 plus cell therapy or gene therapy products that are in phase 3, and most of those belong in the biotech industry. So I think those are two fundamental changes. And frankly, if there is that ambition within the biotech, and we urge all of our biotech companies to play that movie out, some of them get it quite along the way, which is fine. The US remains a very, very important piece of that. Clearly, access to the quantum capital to build out these companies, irrespective of where you want to market the product. All roads go through NASDAQ. And indeed, most of the roads in early commercialization success also go through the US. The prices are 3 times as high. Initial sales, in spite of some of the reimbursement challenges, etc., that Barack quite rightly identified, it ain't easy. But I think with aspiration, the US still remains very important. And for the moment, at least, I think ex-US, certainly through the early stages, is a bit of an afterthought. I don't mean that disrespectfully, it's still important. But I think if it, particularly for a European company, figuring out the US piece is probably the first port of call. And we can come back and talk, as we will, and dig into these things about where Europe sits in that. But certainly with my venture capital hat on, and based on the comments I've made, we certainly feel a company with ambition, is really important to establish a US foothold pretty early on.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I think you made a good point. Of course, you have to nail your US commercial strategy first, because that's the biggest market. And if you don't do that well, then almost there's not a step 2 and a step 3 to take in many cases. Although in one of the previous discussions today, there was actually a bit more talk about regional strategies, and even some cases where there could be a product for Europe that's not for the US. So I'm not sure I know any of examples like that. So then maybe I'll throw out a sort of first question, which is, if the US has been sorted out, then do companies actively seek to realise value in ex-US markets? And then sort of following on from that, if they do, when should they think about those requirements? And I think Berak had talked a little bit in her opening remarks about inflection points and mapping key decision points. So maybe I'll start off with Berak on that question. When should companies think about these requirements? At what phases and what stage?
Yeah, thanks, Mel, for that. And, in terms of the pricing, I think that's where we start, because the pricing dynamics is really the core crux, and the difference in the pricing dynamics is the core crux of this discussion. And to Tim's point, pricing dynamics are probably the determining factor for launch sequencing and commercialization decisions, especially when the teams are small. So the belief that I personally have, and we have, is that, considerations about ex-US need to come and be thought about a must-have. So US must be a must-have, that's agreed. But if the ex-US is also a must-have in terms of capability and knowledge, then depending on what happens in this future of launch in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, then you have a team that's able to refer to external reference pricing very easily, because they know how they've dealt with that in multiple jurisdictions. Come some other pricing debate in the US, because we know with the recent bills, if they come to fruition, employer plans could be capped. Medicare prices could be capped. Where would inflation be with all these different things happening with metals, etc., on the COVID side? So you have a team that's able to take out cards and sprinkle this onto your primary US commercial strategy and really make a good meal when you think about your commercial success. So Mal, to your question, where does it come in? I believe it comes in through the continuum. There is a core function at the very early indication selection, which I believe is the key for early biotech, because if you don't get that right, that could mean a no access ex-US, or that could mean various things depending on which jurisdiction. So that idea of taking preclinical at indication selection and then trying to know what the key metrics, what is the smallest thing that you could do now that would bring you maybe 2 years forward when you think about your ex-US launch, is through the continuum of phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And Mel, to your point, actually, it's, small biotech hasn't been luckier than today. There's in the UK, there's the innovation passport that's opening the doors to companies to engage with the HTA, with the regulators early on. There are similar pan-European initiatives. So maybe it's a good time to have this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, mentioning the innovation passport, that's the sort of first time that something has been really developed so early at the sort of TPP stage to sort of give insights, from payers and HTAs at that very early stage. And a friend of mine who runs quite a well-known positioning company, actually, he thinks that the indication selection is almost one of the first and biggest opportunities to set the value for the asset, because many companies choose the wrong indication and only realize it downstream that they've got a lower value indication. They could have had a higher value one as the first launch. I'd like to also to get you to comment on this particular question as well. Yeah,
sure, and you have to improve on your Dutch, Mel.
I know I struggle with the pronunciation. I'm sorry.
Don't worry about that. Look, the earlier the better. And I know that's a bit of a cheeky answer, but that's what it is. It's to Barrick's point, in the US, if you've spoken to one payer, you've spoken to one. In Europe, joint advice has been around for quite a while. EMA and NICE were actually quite early in this, and it's available. And why wouldn't you make use of it? Well, why wouldn't you make use of it? Maybe you're going to hear something that you don't like. So if you like the ostrich strategy, well, then that's what you're going to do. But if you want to get a bit of an early feel as to what would be necessary when you can still make some amendments to your clinical protocol, for example, I think that's a pretty good idea. On the other side, and this comes from the time when I was in Boston, MIT was very forward-looking in terms of multi-stakeholder interactions, and they would get groups together of seasoned payers and regulatory person and the odd investor like myself to think about outcome-based pricing schemes, and none of these things apply only in the US, right? These are things that apply, I think, quite globally. And again, I think for some indications, not all, that would probably be the way to go at some point, and it's already happening, as we all know. So the earlier the better. I do understand that there's always a question, a bit of bandwidth within teams, particularly the smaller teams. But I also feel that if you don't invest in it at an early enough stage, it's going to haunt you in the end. And then what it also does for you is if again, you'll start to talk maybe to some larger party who might be interested in one of your programs, they're going to find out they have to go back. Some of the work hasn't been done, and then you may not be as advanced as you think you are. So also, I guess, in terms of an ROI perspective from an investor, it makes sense to do it, but that's my view.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think to Tim's earlier point about the availability of capital to small biotech, before there was need for this sort of relentless focus, and maybe you could only go focus on one market at that stage. Now with a bit more capital, maybe you can sort of address a more global opportunity with a little bit more funding at the disposal of small companies. I'd like to move on to another question, really, sort of talking a bit more about the potential US health reforms that we've talked about. Clearly, there's the concerning for big pharma because they're putting a lot of money into lobbying, as I said in the opening. But the question is, how are small companies and their investors preparing for these potential changes, and what sort of mitigations are being or should be considered? And I'm going to put that question first of all to Matthias, please.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mel. And let me again answer this from a BD buyer perspective first, and really touching base and bringing home two factors that I think are important considerations here. Firstly, and that's a little bit of a background fact, but I think it's sometimes overlooked, it's the fact that the environment for buyers is getting tougher, right? If you look at the situation, I mean, costs to bring products to market are increasing, commercial opportunities in certain TAs tend to shrink, product life cycles, think about combinations, tend to shorten, where at the same time, the productivity of our R&D engines across the industry is stagnant at best, I want to say. So the consequence of this is that, so to say, buyers become, generally speaking, more selective when they look at opportunities. And that's true not only for a pure R&D risk associated with programs, but it's also true, so to speak, for commercial risk associated with the programs. And all of that is then a little bit amplified, if you wish, by the high valuations that we're currently seeing for assets and companies in the market. So drilling down a little bit on this commercial risk, because it's the matter of this panel, right? If you now take a macroeconomic perspective and really look at that, there's pressure not only in the US, but really technically around the globe, right? We have US drug pricing reforms coming up. We see similar discussions starting in the EU. We have volume-based pricing in China already being a reality. Then you come a little bit into a crunch situation where all of this may lead to lower revenues, lower absolute profits, lower amounts available to be invested into next generation innovation. And I think the only real strategy how you can, let's say, mitigate that pricing, or let's call it political risk, all over, because there are many aspects that may play into that, is from my point of view really a global commercial diversification approach. And I think we said it already a couple of times here, so that you are kind of a little bit less reliant on political decisions and a change of winds in certain environments around the globe. For the US specific, I think, and again, it's maybe a very easy truth to be told, but at the end, we need to look very early into ex-US markets, and it needs to be a stronger focus, especially to design, and repeating a little bit what I said in the opening statement, but especially to be designed to take into consideration local market access pricing and regulatory environments to really diversify the risk, de-risk with that the asset, limit, so to say, the vulnerability, and drive up the potential deal values for such assets. And Mel, in my view, there are really two ways how you can only do it. One is, of course, you put more money at risk earlier, right, from a VC and PE perspective, and there may be also other ways of how you can bring that excellence and that knowledge, so to say, to portfolio companies in the VC context. But the other piece is clearly for us early stage partnering. And I think there are a couple of regions in the world, if you look at towards China, where kind of regional deal making relatively early on in the development process has been really practiced for a while now with what we believe is great success for the industry. And maybe that is something that we will also see more and more coming to Europe, just to really harvest the value and commercial value opportunities appropriately.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. There was in one of the previous sessions today, they were talking about really needing to bring big pharma in earlier because they have the capabilities ready made to address some of these things. But the problem is often by the time the company comes to the big pharma company, it's too late because they haven't made the right decisions in clinical development. So bringing that earlier makes a lot of sense. On this same question, I'd like to go to Eric, and then Tim, I'm going to ask you for an investor view on this one.
Thanks, Mel. Yeah, maybe for the biotech companies that are listening into this call, so it's not only doom and big and uncontrollable. So I think there are a couple of simple things, right? So we discussed about the selection of the indication, which sometimes can indeed drive the value of what you will get out of your compound. And the US market is of course important to keep in mind, but I do believe you will work anyway on a larger strategy than just a US opportunity from the get-go in the selection of your indication. So also evaluating the other market opportunities. Then in the early phase of development, it's good to include measures that are already specifically addressing questions that you know might get from indeed payers for the market access strategy. I think it's good to do your evaluation from at least say US and European. In Europe, you can concentrate for now on Germany, France, and the UK. Think through what are the key elements that would be required in the specific market access discussions, and you bake it into your phase 2 design. Then, of course, when you go to late-stage clinical development, it becomes much more prominent, because that's where you will define your global access strategy in the design of your study, in the interactions that you have with the regulators, but also in the potential already with the payers. So, as a concrete example, because it was your starting question, yes, it has become more complex. Biotech companies are used to deal with complexity. And we take a very fundamentalistic approach to it. So we have talked to the FDA, the EMA, and the PDMA, and just made one global design, which incorporates running a clinical study across 3 continents, so that we make sure that we have the fastest path forward to get to market in all of these major markets. China is indeed something separate. We'll make our plans throughout the next couple of months on how to go as fast as possible to the Chinese market. But I think that's the practical approach that I would like to contribute to this panel.
Thank you, Eric. And I like the fact you're sort of drilling down into not necessarily trying to sort of take all the themes from across Europe, but actually, even if you just go for one cost effectiveness and one comparative effectiveness type market, you're already sort of picking up probably most of the key themes that you'd need to address early on. So I think that's good advice for companies. Tim, what's your view on this question?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the death of the US golden goose that keeps the global pharma and biotech industry going is greatly exaggerated. Certainly if you read the detail, which I rather boringly have, of the bill that went through Congress, it's a non-event regarding pricing. It really is. That's not to say that it shouldn't be ignored, and there clearly is pricing pressure. Worth remembering that while prices in the US are 3 times higher than they are in Europe, the actual spend on pharmaceutical agents as a percentage of overall healthcare spend is the same as in Europe. So it's just a reflection that everything's too expensive in the US, not just the pharma piece is really expensive. And by the way, half of the profits go through secondary groups, pharmacies, payers, etc. So you just got to put that stuff in perspective. But nonetheless, I think to answer specifically your question, what do you think about as a biotech company to mitigate that, particularly if you are one of those that is thinking about potentially commercializing your product, or even if you're not and you're going to do a deal with a pharma company, you better understand very clearly what the opportunity looks like today, but what it may look like in the future. And I think that the mitigations I've touched on already, some of them around rare diseases, gene therapy, one and done therapy, where there's high unmet need is certainly a lot of where venture capital dollars are going. And there's a Zolgensma is over $2 million for a one and done treatment owned by Novartis, but came out of a biotech company. So I think those are pretty good spaces where the absolute dollars are not going to raise the ire of payers in any country. And I think that's a lot of what you're seeing happening. I think the second piece that is very important, not only for biotech, but for pharma as well, is biomarkers, whereby you are able, using biomarkers, be they neoantigens on cancers, be they blood-related indicators, such that you are giving the drug to somebody that with a high degree of confidence will be a responder. So while as an investor, diagnostics have not been an easy place to invest, I think going forward, they're going to become really critical because they will dramatically enhance the efficacy and the willingness of payers to pay you. So certainly that's an important part of what we're doing when we're investing is around this whole companion diagnostics biomarker strategy. I think the third piece as well kind of relates to that, and it's a pharma question as well as it is a biotech one, is kind of pay for performance. And I do think there will be, and Europe may well be leading the way here, the whole pay for performance issue is probably something we're all going to need to get comfortable with in, pick your time frame, maybe 10 years time, i.e. you'll only get paid if the drug works. And I think that kind of comes back to this, really thoughtful running of clinical studies and ensuring that, it's going to patients where you are going to get a response. and of course you've got your ability to assess the health economics of that patient, and you can kind of predict where the economics are. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about as when we invest in companies. Just to complete that, Mel, if I may, I do think the requirement for a biotech company very early on to understand their market is absolutely critical, and that's certainly something we push companies very hard to do, and that's global economics, and really for two obvious reasons. One, if there is an acquirer who knocks on their door, they better be able to engage around a valuation that really is reflective of the opportunity. The other piece as well is that in many instances there are abilities for a biotech to do a regional deal to bring in capital that doesn't undermine the ability to do a much larger global, in inverted commas, deal with pharma. So we actually push all our companies very early on to be pretty sophisticated about what the value, the future stream of revenues is, not only in the US but globally.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. A couple of points to pick up there. You talked about the sort of this biomarker approach, and it's for me the whole issue of personalized medicine is very much aligned with what HTAs and payers want. Really drilling down to the patients that benefit the most, rather than paying for a lot of patients that don't benefit. And then the other point about pay for performance, I think we've seen in the last couple of years, 3 out of the EU5 markets reiterate their intention to not only continue with pay for performance deals, but actually expand the mechanisms that they're willing to use to bring products into the market on that basis. So I think points are well made. There's actually a question in the chat that I'd like to pose to the group, which is sort of linked to your last point about understanding your market. The question is, could you also comment about other geographies, markets, in terms of commercial strategy, e.g. China, and others? And I'll leave that to where the sort of energy is in terms of answering that question.
Short answer is it depends on the indication, right? Where you basically your development will take you, which may indeed take you to Asia, for example, or settling in the US alone, because of a certain indication. But generally speaking, I would say, of course, if you do not include the US market in your development strategy, it typically doesn't work from a financial return perspective. So you cannot develop a drug just for the rest of the world in general.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment on commercial strategy in other regions?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's hard to kind of go direct and many pharma don't go direct in China, nor indeed in places like Japan, but there's some real opportunities there. We at least 3 of our portfolio companies, more later stage, have done deals with Chinese groups, some of which are listed on NASDAQ, by the way, so very easy to interact with. And I think those are certainly very sensible strategies. There clearly are a whole variety of specialty sales groups that can sell product in places like Eastern Europe as well. So I think they're very important things to be thought about. And I think the other piece I would say is, if you went back 20 years ago when I was running a biotech, there was always concern that if you give away a little piece of geography, is a Roche or Novartis never going to knock on your door because they want to own every single global right? That certainly we feel is changing, and I do think there's a lot more pragmatism amongst pharma. They are facing arguably up to $200 billion of patent cliff revenue in the next 5 years. And I think as the markets have got a little bit hotter, the ability for a biotech to slice and dice geographically means there should be, I think, a greater inclination to think about localized strategies, particularly where the potential pharma acquirer of the company may not be that strong, and that's certainly China, Japan, but there are other markets too.
Yeah, absolutely. Tim, does anyone else want to pick up on that, or sort of comment on the sort of evolution of more regional deals?
I just want to make a quick comment on what Tim just said. I mean, fully agree with that. Yeah. The only thing I think that we all need to be more aware of at the end is that the value opportunities for such markets like China, like Asian markets, like also South American markets, it's not insignificant. And if you think about it from an M&A view, what we need to be very aware of is that we generate with kind of regional deals tainted assets from a certain perspective, right? That's also given. I'm just saying this because at the end of the day, I think it's not a problem to work with parties together that are, so to say, living up to global biotech and global pharmaceutical standards, right? But if you have a player that may not live up to that standards, that can really become a problem. So again, fully subscribing to the regional deal model. We do them ourselves for regions with certain companies. I think it's really, really important that you have a player, so to say, that understands how to develop a drug, because otherwise it gets very, very painful for whoever acquires at a certain point in time the rest of the rights globally.
Well said.
Excellent. Thank you, Matthias. So I'm going to go to another question now. So how do investors influence the focus of small companies in relation to US, ex-US commercialization? Is this changing? Does it need to change to future-proof exits? Should investors be doing more to help companies in this space? And I'm going to go to you for this question first of all. I hope I've done better on the pronunciation.
Much better.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Eric can be the objective judge of that. That's very good. Look, maybe just one point to further, build on what Tim just said. If you want, in this environment, if you want premium pricing for something, you're going to have to be innovative. Now, we all know that. Now, what does innovative mean? Innovative probably means that you're better than the standard of care, if there's such a thing as standard of care. Innovative also means that you find a subpopulation in a disease where you're actually better than standard of care. And that's an area where at Guild, obviously, we're quite active as well, because we don't only look at therapeutics, but also at diagnostics, health tech, all these things. So whatever the approach might be, for example, identify and stratify patients is of high interest. And we all are very well at the omics platform, but this day and age, for example, on the imaging side, there's quite a few things that you can do to do exactly that. So I fully agree with Tim that that's an area where if you want to be to some extent shielded from all the payer rigorously, probably in an area where you really add something for an identified population, that's one of these areas where you can probably still have strong pricing power, and rightfully so, because you're really adding something to the armamentarium. How do you influence, or how do you do it as an investor? Well, on one hand, by where you choose to invest, I guess, this is one of these areas, but then also once you're on board, try to be more than just a bag of money, and try to help these companies and these management teams that are always time constrained with some access that you may have into the broader stakeholder community. I think that's something that I think really can add value. On the Gilda side, we don't believe we want to take the seat of the management team. We do want to be there and provide some access if that's something that the management teams are interested in. I think at the end of the day, we all have a responsibility. One of the things as a public market investor, which I've been most of my time, one of the things I've always been amazed by is this mantra that we have on the public side, which is short to launch, right? So a company does all the work and gets there against the odds in this industry, brings out a product, and the public market knows, well, that's a perfect short opportunity. For those of you who don't know what shorting is, very simple. You speculate on the fact that on the hope that the share price will go down. I'll save you the technicality of how you do that. That's weird, right? That probably tells you that something is wrong along the way. Either it's not a relevant product, either the pricing didn't go well, either the payers are going to throw up huge barriers, whatever it might be. So that's another area where, or maybe to Tim's point, maybe you didn't stratify the population well enough. Maybe the benefit is not as high as you perceive it to be. So if I'm not saying all this is easy and simple, but if at an early stage you can help by providing a bit of a broader perspective, I think that's something from an investor side you can also help with.
Yeah. Thank you. I've actually got another question in the chat, but we're sort of running into the last 10 minutes. I think it might be quite a quick question, actually. It's a question from Peter Rice. Are there any situations where a company should consider an ex-US first strategy? And are there any changes that can make that more attractive? Anyone want to sort of take that one?
If you need the cash, and you can't get it from other places, then do a BD deal, but don't give away the US.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Any other comments on that one?
Well, I would say if you really need the cash, do a global deal, but that's maybe a discussion for another day.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I think we're sort of in the wrap-up phase now. So I'd like to, there's one sort of last question really that I'm going to ask. Maybe each of you could do a quick one on how do we think that this whole space in terms of partnering and collaboration might evolve between small companies, big pharma, investors, to ensure that we end up with more products that are suitable for the global market. And we can take any order on this one.
Mel, if I may start. Sorry, Eric.
Go ahead.
Here, what I'm thinking about is, in my ideal scenario, if there's a platform similar to the iLabs of the world, instead of it being with regulators and all these agencies, but if there's a platform between the early biotech, the acquiring big pharma, and the investor at that indication selection phase, because that phase, if that's wrong, then everything else almost is too difficult. It's like a failed launch, right? How many failed launches go back and fix the launch? But if you do that well, and if there's a mechanism to do that well with the investor community, with the VCs, with the bigger biotech, with the big pharma, and with the capability to bring that on, and there's almost a value-based mechanism as to how to do that in that community in itself, then that brings products forward. And then on the smaller biotech, pre-commercial biotech side, I think it's very important that the team is the key, because that's the asset you have pre-commercially. And that team has to know, needs to be ex-US knowledge, so that they have that in their pocket and they can pull it out as needed. And those connections are there and that insight is there without compromising the US.
Thank you, Barak. Some good suggestions there. Thank you. I'm going to go to Eric. Eric, you were going to jump in here on this.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Maybe two things. One is indeed to Barak's point. So absolutely, in an early stage, as biotech companies do speak with pharma and investors, do help with the network to get these early market insights into the selection of an indication, into the development program. Definitely recommend that. You asked, of course, what the changes will be going forward. Well, big change, of course, is, as earlier pointed out, there's much more money for biotech companies available. So what you will see is that biotech companies will hold on to its rights for a longer period of time, or develop multiple compounds from a platform itself whilst partnering on others. And that will change the dynamics. So the customer base is not large pharma anymore. The customer base is the patient. And your global partnering strategy will be aligned with that. So I agree with Matthias that you shouldn't partner with a partner that then reduces the value in other parts of the world. But at the same time, biotech, we're not going to wait for when large pharma is going to make the move. We have a responsibility to get the medicines to the market and to patients. And if you cannot invest in a global strategy, you will have to partner to make sure you get early on to patients, also in areas where you would traditionally not develop a drug for. So I think that dynamic will definitely change, and it will be more interesting.
Thank you, Eric. Who would like to go next?
Well, maybe let me share three trends that I see. Also a little bit to Eric's point, I think trend number one is really do it yourself and do it on your own, right? I think cash is at the moment available in an abundant scale, if you want to think of, at least for good companies and good assets. Yeah. So I think a lot of people can build up these capabilities to really develop assets with a global scope for key markets ex-US. The second thing that I can see is a little bit a counter movement, but it's kind of partner early on and share risk. Yeah? Because there is a lot of cash available, maybe still, so to say, there is the need to tap into the resources of a global development engine like pharma companies do offer it. And I think what we see more and more, either with option deals or really with co-development, co-commercialization deals, is that the investor community and also the biotechs themselves are really, up to have skin in the game, right? And I think that is something that we see more. So true partnerships versus licensing deals. And then the last one, really regional deals. And I think we said it before. I think regional deals, as we've seen them in China, and how also China, and maybe that's also a good role model, developed over the last years, that is something that I truly believe we will see more and more also for regions like Europe as well as South America.
Thank you, Matthias. Then we've got you and Tim to go next. Who would like to go first?
I'll go, maybe. Go ahead.
You go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Matti's comments were really spot on, and I think very well said. I think the relationship between biotech, pharma, and investors is becoming incredibly blurred now, and I think that's in a positive way. Biotech companies have now got aspirations to grow up and become pharma companies, and there's a capital available to do that on the one hand. I think, as Matti said, we're also seeing pharma come a lot earlier to do some really creative deals, build to buy. We were fortunate enough to cater exercise an option on a company in London, Gamma Delta Therapeutics, last week, where they came in. It was pretty much a twinkle in a professor's eye. They put some non-dilutive capital in. We were the major owner, but a real win-win for the investors and for the caterer. So I think my view is, I think the relationships are becoming much, much stronger, much more open, and there really is this blurring of lines between what the individuals are doing, but I think in a very positive way, I would add. So I think it's really good. Biotech does have the ability to retain more value. How that plays out over the long term, and what, if I'm really exaggerating for effect, but what is pharma's role going to be in 10 years' time if the biotech is the engine of innovation that it seems to be today? So I think there's a very interesting dynamic, but I think for the most part it remains a golden age of biotech. And even if public investors or venture capitalists go away, the pharma industry thankfully still has well over $1 trillion that they're probably going to need to spend on biotech, and will probably spend more when these markets are less exuberant. So very bullish, I think.
Yeah. Thank you, Tim. And so the last word goes to you.
Well, that's an honor. I appreciate that. It won't be a very different opinion from the other 4 people that you've heard before. I think this ecosystem is evolving in a positive way. I think it's a fact that a lot of things have popped up at much earlier places that maybe 10, 15 years ago wouldn't be conceivable, and that here we are. And that means that pharma goes in earlier. And that also means that there's a network on the investment side, something that's to be shared with some of the pharma companies, and vice versa. There will always be products that are not, well commercialized by smaller entities. You're going to need the cloud and the muscle and the marketing, and then particularly also the local knowledge to get things done effectively. And that's in everybody's interest, because to Eric's point, at the end of the day, we have a responsibility to get these things to patients and make that, have that done in an effective way. So I agree with that. I think that's a very evolving, in a positive way, evolving ecosystem that we're in. And the only thing I would, tell the people listening into this video call, which is a completely something that everybody knows, I guess, but engage as early as possible. People like Tim and myself on the investment side have seen so many things that at some point, also on the public side, put yourself in my shoes. I think in the last 3 years, we have 250 new companies listed. It's just completely nuts out there. So at the end of the day, we're human as well. So if I know you and I've seen you before, that probably helps. And so in terms of, engaging with the investment side as early as possible. But that's my addition to it. Mel.
Thank you. So I think that brings us to the close of the panel. I just want to say a huge thank you to Tim, Barak, Eric, Joop, and Matthias for their contributions today. Thanks for the questions that came in from the audience, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Investival for the next few days, and then Jefferies. Thank you very much, and with that, goodbye.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mel. Let me reiterate the same thanks to Matthias, Tim, Eric, Barak, and Joop, and obviously Mel for guiding us through that session. I think we covered a lot of ground there, and I hope it was valuable to all those who were listening. If you did miss it or join late, it is immediately available on demand, as with all the sessions, so you can catch up on anything you've missed. As we appreciate, obviously, people are back to a bit more of a normal life than perhaps they were over the last 18 months or so. Thanks for joining throughout today. We're back tomorrow. Mel mentioned Jefferies there. We're kicking off with a keynote presentation from Gil Barnaham, who's going to be going through the sort of state of the IPO markets and the sort of transactions market in general and what they're seeing from Jefferies, followed by a number of other sessions, masterclasses, and of course, encourage everyone to visit all the booths and go and view the company showcases. This event is all about showcasing innovative life science companies, so please do join those company showcase sessions and see what's out there. Look forward to seeing everyone. Hopefully, if there are some people joining on the 15th of November for the in-person partnering day that we're having, very excited to bring people back together in person. But for now, thanks all for joining today. We'll see you all tomorrow at 9 o'clock for the start of our keynote sessions.